Despite the fact that there are more than 2 million Iraqis seeking refuge from the war, the U.S. has allowed fewer than 200 to enter its borders since the invasion in 2003. Noor Al-Khal is one of the few that have been lucky enough to be allowed in, and now she's trying to create awareness of the plight of her fellow countrymen. WBGO's Boyd Delanzo has the story.
Stephen Vincent was a successful freelance journalist in Iraq. He wrote stories for some of the nation's most prestigious papers. Noor Al-Khal was his Iraqi translator in the southern Iraqi city of Basra. By Stephen's third trip to Iraq in 2005, she says things were much more dangerous for the two of them.
It was no more safe, and we were planning to leave actually, but unfortunately it was apparently too late.
Stephen and Noor were kidnapped and shot by men wearing Iraqi police uniforms after Stephen wrote a story for the New York Times highlighting police corruption. Stephen was killed, but Noor survived despite being shot 3 times. After his death, his widow Lisa Ramachi began the difficult process of trying to get Noor to safety in the United States. Noor already fled to Amman, Jordan, where she joined hundreds of thousands of Iraqi refugees. The process was often more arduous than Lisa ever imagined.
None of the people I worked with for the prior year had ever said to me, you know, we're not letting in Iraqis. The only Iraqis allowed to migrate to the United States are military translators. We're only letting in 50 a year, and at this point there's a 7-year backlog. This woman that you're trying to get over here did not work for the military. She doesn't stand a chance.
The International Rescue Committee is a leading humanitarian relief organization based in New York City. The vice president of the IRC's resettlement program, Bob Carey, says very few Iraqi refugees have been allowed to enter the country since the beginning of the war.
Well, very few have actually been resettled. Unfortunately, in spite of the U.S. government announcements that they would be admitting 7,000, only about 170 have been admitted thus far.
Carey says that after 4 years of war, life is becoming very hard for Iraqi refugees.
They're living mixed among the general population, primarily in Damascus and Amman. So you go down the back alleys and you see people who are living in dire poverty. Their children often don't have access to school. They don't have access to medical services. They cannot legally work, and they are subject to arrest and forced return at any time.
The 2 million Iraqi refugees that live in Jordan and Syria have become a large burden for those governments. These are poor countries that do not have the resources to handle such a large humanitarian crisis. They also do not recognize the Iraqis in their country as being refugees, and instead refer to them as guests, which means they do not have the same rights as refugees. This is because neither country ever signed the 1951 Refugee Convention. The Deputy High Commissioner at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Craig Johnston, says the problem is continuing to grow with as many as 2,000 refugees moving into Syria every day.
And at the beginning of the war, they tended to be the upper classes and the people who had some money to get by. Now we're seeing people who are much more in a poverty situation and much more difficult circumstances.
Aid agencies around the world are doing what they can to ease this escalating crisis, but because so many of these refugees are viewed as being guests instead of refugees, there are no central camps to deliver aid or provide basic services. Johnson says there's one other problem.
It's a very difficult situation, compounded by the fact that the security situation is so bad that humanitarian organizations have a hard time getting to them.
The amount of displaced people, coupled with continual violence, is turning Iraq into one of the largest humanitarian disasters in the world, rivaling Darfur. According to a recent report, 1/3 of the Iraqi population needs emergency aid. Around 8 million urgently need water, sanitation, food, and shelter. According to Johnston, a number of humanitarian groups are putting pressure on the U.S. government to accept more refugees. In response, the U.S. has agreed to take an additional 7,000 by the end of the year.
We were urged to do referrals of 7,000 by the 30th of June, and we lived up to that. UNHCR did. We intend to do 20,000 by the end of the year. I think it's going to be difficult for the United States to live up to those numbers, but there's a commitment there, and we expect that commitment to be abided by.
Through hard work and due to the high profile of the case, Lisa Ramachi, the widow of journalist Stephen Vincent, was eventually able to get Noor Al-Khal into the U.S. They are now fighting together to change American policy to allow more Iraqi refugees into the country. Ramachi says they've recently attended congressional hearings in D.C.
Some of them were very pro allowing the refugees into the country. Others were anti. Others were straddling the fence because, as one of them said to me, Nobody wants to be the senator or the congressperson that approves allowing Iraqi refugees in, and then one of them turns out to be a terrorist.
Despite some congressmen's fears, Bob Kerry of the International Rescue Committee says there are many Iraqi refugees that they know pose no threat to U.S. security.
Security is a legitimate concern, but there's certainly within the 2 million plus people, there are certainly many people who are known to the U.S. and who do not pose any security risk. This has the potential to not only be a long-term humanitarian problem, but also to destabilize an entire region.
And beyond all else, Noral Call says she believes the U.S. has a moral obligation to help Iraqi refugees.
The United States are completely responsible for the refugees crisis, actually, after the invasion.
It appears Congress is finally beginning to take notice. In May, a bill was introduced in the House proposing that the U.S. accept up to 60,000 Iraqis who work for the U.S. or any contractors, subcontractors, or American-based non-governmental organizations. However, the Senate has taken no action. Meanwhile, 1/6 of the Iraqi population has been displaced, with thousands more fleeing every day. For the WBGO Journal, I'm Boyd Delanzo.
I pledge to solve my own problems without a weapon.
I pledge to solve my own problems without a weapon.
Dozens of Newark citizens showed up at the anti-violence campaign and pledged to solve their differences without the use of violence. This is part of a new initiative by community-based group Stop Shooting Incorporated. The group believes they can help reduce crime in the city by making thousands of Newark youths pledge to solve their problems peacefully. The organization's co-founder, Tariq Onke, says their main mission is
to reverse this senseless trend of gun violence that's going on the streets of Newark right now, not only in the streets of Newark, but in other urban communities around the whole United States.
The organization says it believes the campaign will give hope to kids like 16-year-old Kakia, who has little hope that the violence will stop.
Nah, like, you see it every day, you gotta deal with it every day, but hopefully it'll stop. Like, you can't put no end into it, really.
In Newark, I'm Boyd Delanzo, WBGO News. The high cost of college tuition these days is a financial burden that many families find hard to bear. For the 8 high school seniors receiving scholarships, like Jonathan Vela of Eastside High School, the money will give them the opportunity to attend their first school of choice.
The scholarship actually means a lot. It's helping pay like half of my fall semester.
Although, Jonathan says things were not always so easy for he and his mother after they immigrated from Ecuador.
She didn't have enough money and she didn't know English again, so she had to work in McDonald's. So we were forced to live in a basement until she could do better.
The Brick City Scholarship Fund is a partnership between the City of Newark and private donors. According to the National Center for Educational Statistics, the average tuition for a 4-year college is now around $16,000. With the cost of education so high, as these 8 students will tell you, every penny counts. In Newark, I'm Boyd Delanzo, WBGO News.